Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. To mark International Day of Forests on the 21st of March, tonight we'll take a closer look at the issue of forest plantations, which aims to turn degraded forests into a renewable source of timber. But in the last 2 decades, forest plantations have emerged as one of the top drivers of forest cover loss in Peninsular Malaysia. Now, has the strategy of forest plantations succeeded in providing a supply of sustainable timber, which in turn would then help reduce logging in natural forests? Let's ask our guest tonight, Dr. Lau Yao Hua. He's a science journalist for Macaranga, which is a news site covering issues of the environment and sustainability in Malaysia. He was recently selected as a fellow in the first cohort of the Pulitzer Center's Rainforest Investigation Network to write on forest use in Peninsular Malaysia. Yao Hua, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Macaranga, in collaboration with the Forest Investigation Network at the Pulitzer Center, you guys recently put out a 4-part series on forest plantations, and I thought that's really interesting. But maybe we could begin our conversation today by maybe you can tell us what you were hoping to achieve, to discover by investigating this issue.
Hi, Melissa and Sharad. Yeah, thanks for having me. Yes, so it's a 4-part series, a year-long investigation. And what we really wanted to do was to investigate if forest plantations are being run sustainably in Peninsular Malaysia. I mean, forest plantations are all over Malaysia, but because of the pandemic and because I'm here in KL, so of course we focus on Peninsular Malaysia. So yeah, that's the objective, to see if they are sustainable in terms of the economics, in terms of the environment, and in terms of the social impact.
Rahul, could you help us understand the origins of the very strategy? I mean, whether in Malaysia or kind of internationally, was this something that was adopted with a clear sense of how it would contribute to the preservation of the forest and also the questions of biodiversity, which Malaysia very proudly boasts, one of the top mega diverse countries of the world?
Yeah, so forest plantation is not a new thing. It has been around for decades. Well, basically, much of Europe's natural forests have been, chopped off and are now replaced with planted forests, right? So forest plantations are recognized as a type of forest under the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization. So let's be clear on that. And the purpose of that is, the whole idea is that forest plantations, they are basically tree farms, right? They would clear the area. If the area wasn't already cleared, they would clear the area and then replant it with a single species of fast-growing trees. The idea is that it's easier to manage, right? And then we can get timber out of that piece of land every 7, even as fast as 5 years to 15 years, depending on what species you plant. Some species will go longer, but usually it's 5 to 15 years. So that's the idea. That's the production. That's the production rationale for having forest plantations. The conservation rationale has also been put forward, and it's the idea that if we only log forest plantations, and if forest plantations can provide a substantial amount of timber, then we don't have to touch the natural forest. And in doing so, we would be able to ease the logging pressure of the natural forest. So that would be the conservation part of it. That's the conservation argument. You mentioned biodiversity. It is without a doubt that forest plantations would have far less biodiversity compared to a natural forest, just because you are talking about one single tree species compared to hundreds of tree species and the whole ecosystem that a natural forest provide. That is not to say that forest plantations have zero biodiversity. They do have.
Yeah, if I could just follow up on that, because as you say, it's a single species, it's fast growing, but we know there's also demand for all kinds of other kinds of wood. Tropical hardwoods, teak are very popular and in demand. these forest plantations, I imagine, are not going to be suppliers of those kinds of woods. And so, if the rationale was to protect the untouched forests, uh, what do we do with this demand for all kinds of exotic woods?
Well, your question, is really like hitting it like spot on. You're right. So, we did try, like Malaysia did try to plant teak, very early on. It didn't work. I don't remember exactly why it didn't work. But yes, so much of the sawmills in Peninsular Malaysia, much of the wood that we export, the price wood, that we export would be, like Meranti, Chengal, Merbau, that kind of wood, kapur, and those would take decades to grow, like at least 30 years, and it wouldn't be, feasible financially as a forest plantation. And in turn, we are planting trees like rubber, acacia, eucalyptus, all these very, exotic, fast growing trees. So the idea, in the early 2000s, there was a survey done by the Malaysian Timber Council, by FRAME, by the Forestry Department Peninsula Malaysia, among the wood industries, and there was a huge support for rubber wood. Now, rubber wood, contributes to about, over 80% of the furniture made in Peninsular Malaysia, perhaps the whole Malaysia. And so rubber wood is in huge demand. And so the Malaysian government really pushed for forest plantations to plant at least 50% of rubber trees, which of a certain variety called the timber latex clone. So, this grows bigger, faster, produces more timber, and you can tap it for latex, while you wait for it to mature, and, you cut it. So this rubber wood would, provide the source material for chipboards for the furniture company. I have heard, a representative from the wood industry say that, providing rubber wood would be able to ease some of the competition for, source materials, because, some sawmills, when they ran out of Meranti, when they don't have that kind of wood, then they will also look for rubber wood. Although you're right that if we just plant rubber wood and acacia and eucalyptus, it is not going to meet the demand, of the loggers who are supplying to, to make like really nice table made of ranti, or like, Meranti floorboards. It's not going to meet those demands. So you're right. It is questionable how, massive plantations of rubber wood will actually ease logging pressure for those type of woods. I don't think that is properly addressed, yet in the program.
Okay. Can I ask you, Yao, where exactly these forest plantations are? You paint a picture of, single species plantations to grow for timber, but where are they? Are they in open land? Are they in the cities? Are they in forest reserves? Where exactly? Maybe you can give us an idea of where they are and what kind of size and how big are these forest plantations?
Yeah, so forest plantations are all in, no, they are not in the cities. They are all in, at least in Peninsular Malaysia, they're almost entirely, I think all of it is grown in forest reserves. So what we call permanent reserve forest, or in Malay, hutan simpan kekal, right? In Peninsular Malaysia, as far as I could tell, that's the case. In Sabah and Sarawak, I'm not sure if it's all in their forest reserves. There could be some on private land or state land. I think that it's possible there. But here it's all in forest reserves. And what sizes are we talking about? So, what has been established in Peninsular Malaysia, like forest plantations that's actually established, it's not more than 130,000, hectares for the whole of Peninsular Malaysia.
Yahua, so you're telling us that forest plantations are actually within a forest reserve? So part of a forest has been planted for tree farms?
Yes, you're right. So this would be, our forest reserves, about 70% of our forest reserves in Peninsular Malaysia are reserved for production, for logging, for sustainable logging, right? And of those 70%, a part of it has been zoned for forest plantations. So they are zoned to clear and then converted into, tree farms. Yeah.
So there's commercial activity happening within a permanent forest reserve. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's always been the case that, our forest reserve, 70% of it, 60 to 70% of our forest reserve has always been, allocated for sustainable logging or sustainable forestry, so commercial activities. Yeah. Except that the thing that's different about forest plantations, these tree farms, is that instead of taking only the bigger trees as what we have been doing for sustainable logging, we will clear the area and then we plant with one type of tree. Yeah.
So can we come back to the question of the objective of all this, and if biodiversity is a central plank in the movement to kind of really protect the environment, and whether it's got to do with climate change, or it's got to do with carbon sinks, or it's got to do with our water supply and so on and so forth. Do they solve some? I mean, to be fair, does this idea, this concept, and the practice go some way along the way to addressing those issues?
Well, the main issue, the main goal of forest plantations is to provide timber. Now, there's no doubting that. Yeah, all the others, whether it's conservation, biodiversity, water catchment, climate regulation, those, as far as the policymakers and the people who come with the plan are concerned, those are secondary. I mean, you could read it in the tone that they use in the development of this program, and also in the interviews that I've made. So the production of timber is the foremost goal. And when it comes to biodiversity or water catchment, yes, a forest plantation can serve those. It can harbor animals for sure. It can harbor insects. It can harbor plants, especially there are some type of trees that they plant, like batai, that grow well with shrubs. So if you plant rubber, you want to clear most of all the weeds, so it's very clean, so there will be less biodiversity there. But if you plant some other types like batai, then you can have a higher biodiversity there. You can have wild boars going through for sure. Elephants, apparently, the planters told me, don't really damage batai, so they're happy to have elephants, wild boars there, but not for the rubber trees. And water catchment, I haven't read anything about that, but there are trees, and if it's like a batai, if you walk into a batai plantation, you would think that it's a regenerating forest. I mean, to us, who are not experts, right? The trees will all look like trees to us, and then the ground is like undergrowth. We get bitten by mosquitoes and stuff, and oh yeah, this is a forest to us. So I think in terms of water catchment, it would serve some purpose too. That the argument, or I guess the point of contention, is it definitely cannot play these functions as well as a natural forest, degraded or not. It still can't play the function as well as a natural forest. So then the contention is, are we giving away too much, of this ecosystem services, of these places, habitats for the animals, in return for timber production? I think that's the point of contention.
Okay, Yahua, we're going to take a quick break, but let's come back and continue this conversation. Still a lot to cover on this topic. We will be right back here on Consider This. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Sharad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation with Lau Yahua, who is a science journalist with Macaranga. We're discussing the issue of forest plantations, which has the objective of turning degraded forests into a renewable source of timber. But is it as sustainable source of timber as it is touted to be? Yahua, what this program, this initiative of forest plantations, where do you see what went wrong with its implementation? Why hasn't it achieved maybe some of the goals that it touted to be able to do?
Yeah, I think right off, I think the whole program, the whole effort, right? It's not just a program. All the efforts by the state forestry departments, by the federal government, I think it's there are enough issues to call for a good comprehensive review, especially given the money that they have put in. So the first thing is that, as we said in the first half of the show, that all the forest plantations in Peninsular Malaysia are being developed inside forest reserves. Up to 9% of our forest reserves in Peninsular Malaysia have been zoned for forest plantations. That's quite a bit, right? But that wasn't the original proposal by the Malaysian Timber Council, framed by the Forestry Department. It was far less than that. Somehow along the way, forest plantations were not developed in private land, were not developed in state land, were not developed in the lands of like Felda, Felkra, and Brisda, but rather into forest reserves. We shall not get into why that's the case. There have been several reasons given, but that's the consequence. That's what we see now. And so then that means it's a lot of it's natural forest that's being replaced with tree farms, right? And they say they would want to do it only on degraded land, and they have a definition for degraded land. And without getting into the nitty-gritty of that technical definition, that the threshold for that degraded land is put so high that, according to the Forestry Department's own inventory, more than half of our forest area in Peninsular Malaysia would be degraded forest. So, by extension, you can argue that if they want, they can zone, more than half of our reserves as forest plantation. But that's not even like the most problematic thing. The thing is, at least half of the forest plantations, at least half of the areas, right, that have been cleared for forest plantations have not been replanted with the trees that the planters were supposed to carry out, right? So they came in, they logged the place, they cleared it, they sold the timber, and then 3 years after, more than 50% of those areas have not been replanted. In other words, they were either abandoned or just left. I guess the whole operation is suspended. And the Forestry Department acknowledges this. They know this is happening, and they know it's a problem. And the problem is especially severe in Kelantan and Pahang, which are the two states with the most forest plantations, and they've cleared the most. So yeah.
But so what's happening? Is it that this idea of forest plantation becomes a pretext for the kind of, clearing, felling of land that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise? So you have to propose a forest plantation in order to first exploit the land. And then you say, well, actually, it's not financially feasible and I don't want to continue with the project, by which time, because the land's already cleared and you've made your money. I mean, is there this level of cynicism operating in the industry?
Well, it depends on who you ask. I've spoken to loggers who right out say, it has been excused to clear log forest reserves, using a forest plantation project. And the forestry departments, they do, admit that too. They say that in the earlier years, they did not have the right procedure to properly vet the developers. So when the loggers came in, the loggers applied for the projects, they got approved, and then they logged, and then they didn't replant. So that's the consequence of it now. So whether there was real, so definitely the loggers had that intent. At least a part of a group of the loggers, had that intention to just log and not replant. There are also valid reasons for them going in with well-intentioned wanting to replant, but then they have no experience of replanting. It's a really different project compared to logging. Logging, you just clear, especially if it's clear logging, it's much easier to do. But then you have to replant, and many of these trees, you have to wait at least 5 to 7 years before you can get any return in income. You have to wait, you have to put in the money for like 5 to 7 years. So you need you need millions of capital upfront, right? Some of them would use the revenue from the timber that they sold to put into that. Others, they just, I guess, run off with the money. However, they would be penalized in Kelantan. The developer would have to put in a deposit right at the start. So if they do not replant, the the forestry department, the state government, essentially will forfeit that deposit. But planters have also told me that if the forest was rich enough, the initial clear felling would provide such a windfall profit that the penalty it's fine. They can pay the penalty.
Yahua, can I ask you how this strategy of forest plantations and the subsequent failure of some of these plantations to replant, how that's impacted indigenous communities, the Orang Asli who perhaps depend on the ecology of forest reserves?
Yeah, so I've spoken to Orang Asli communities in Kelantan, and they've said that when it used. So now the forest around them, they rely on forests. Well, not entirely, right? But they do rely on the forest for some foods, medicine, and many of the materials that they use in their cultural ceremonies, right? Like sewang, right? But then when you replace that forest, that natural forest, with like just rubber trees, they're not going to find any of the source materials that they used to find there. So it definitely damages, it hurts their traditional practices. That's one. And on a more physical aspect, there are increased and more violent wildlife conflict. Animals displaced by the loss of the natural forest, and then they would barge into the Orang Asli's farm. They would damage their houses, damage their farms, and of course we have seen in Kelantan of late, right? Tigers attacking, killing Orang Asli, and the fatality occurs on both sides for wild animals and people.
Yeah, I think you said earlier that maybe the time is ripe for a review. I wonder if the argument that's going to ultimately win the day is going to have to be an economic one. And we look at revenues for the country, for the state. Cursory look at it, apparently it's declining, it has been declining since 2015. Is the argument ultimately that logging, even this so-called sustainable logging, is so damaging and it's kind of, in some sense, not worth what it's supposedly producing for the country as a whole and for the public? Whether individual developers make a windfall and enrich themselves is one thing, but should policy kind of look at whether this should be a sunset industry and essentially push it off the cliff?
Yeah, I don't think you'll find much support to say for logging or the wood industries to be a sunset industry. The wood industry, exports of wood products do contribute to more than 20 billion a year to Malaysia, and so that's substantial. We can argue for the all these values of ecosystem services to the people, flood prevention, and all these things, right? Especially of late. But I kind of think that we don't even need to go down that route. Now, that's a very important route to take, and I hope more work goes into that. But I think even if we just look at forest plantations in itself, whether it is economically feasible, whether it is whether the market is developed and synchronized with the forest plantations enough to make new investments in forest plantations worthwhile. A very telling sign was that I spoke to a planter in Kelantan, and his company has like 8,800 hectares, one of the largest and earliest private forest plantations in Kelantan. It's 15 years since he has started, and the forestry departments visit his plantation, so obviously it's kind of good, right? And I asked him, like, would you enter forest plantation business right now? And he right off said, no, I regret doing it 15 years ago. I will not do it now. It's just too difficult to do it. They have all sorts of issues. So I think the review, even if you take a financial and economic argument, is to look at, is to stop. I think to stop developing first, and to look at how the markets, the demand and supply, the data, where we are planting it, and whether there's enough labor to plant it, and we also need to improve the added value of our plantations. We are still relying on cheap labor, which is definitely not the way to go.
Right. Yahua, thank you so much for shedding light on this really important topic. It's been a fascinating conversation. Appreciate your time speaking with us tonight. You can find out more about forest plantations by going to makaranga.org and looking up their 4-part Ladang Hutan series. And that is the end of our episode for Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.